So welcome back to our video series, the Lomax video series. Up until now, we've been looking at quite a lot of strength training movements, mostly using body weight with some bands and some kettlebell movements. But all of those movements, whether you use body weight or whether you use advanced exercises like barbell squats, will create stiffness and mobility issues in your joints. That in itself isn't great, but why it's really not great is if you're trying to build a body that is a metabolic furnace of burning fat and all these sorts of things, if you're not using your full range of motion, i.e. the body's complete capability of movement, you're never going to activate all the muscle fibers, which means you're not going to be doing the thing, those movements aren't going to be doing their sort of optimum. So what we want to try and do quickly today is look at some strategies that can help with that. We are going to focus chiefly on using trigger point today. In future videos, we will be looking at doing resistance band work, stuff that you may have seen in books like Kelly Starrett's Supple Leopard. We'll be looking at using slider work, activation work, using booty band, all those sorts of things we'll be dealing with. But today, I just want to have a quick look at the trigger point kit. Everyone will have seen one of these, to all intents and purposes, a foam roller. It has three critical areas. One is a flat surface here, which actually represents the palm of a hand if you were doing manual therapy or soft tissue release therapy. The second part of it, which is important to look at, is these long striations, which represent fingers, again from the manual soft tissue therapy world. And finally, these little bumps here, which again are much more, which is where sort of the trigger point gets. These are much more like fingers and thumbs, or knuckles, where you would be pushing into specific areas for specific release work. Again, we would tend to use this piece of work majoritatively on the lower body, which we will run through. A couple of other pieces of kit, though, before we get started. Trigger point, because they're basically torture devices, have developed a series. The quad baller is the next phase. It's as you can see, the shape of it is slightly different. And the reason for that is that as you move towards the middle of this, the area of pressure changes and it becomes smaller. So i.e. the smaller the area of pressure that's applied to the muscle, the more targeted the delivery of that trigger point activity is. So again, that's it. And then finally, at the bottom end of the scale is the ball. Good areas for this are sort of, back, little areas in your back where you're really trying to get into specific areas of release. It has a sort of pointy bit and a sort of, as I said, that curvature there is very, very targeted. So you've gone from a kind of flat surface, really, to a very targeted round surface. So those are the things to bear in mind before we get cracking. First thing we're going to do is look at Wes's lower body, because that's the area where we as a gym, we favour squats and lunges and deadlifts and all those sorts of things in our strength training. And realistically, if you can't get deep and you can't get into those positions, in those lunge positions, you're not going to, as I said, you're not going to optimize those movements. So first up, Wes is going to look at commonly called an overhead squat, which is one of the hardest movements to do in my view, because the really big areas in the body that tend to get stiff or lack mobility as a result of strength training are these joints here and here. And that is because they're the same joint. They're a ball and socket joint, effectively. So the hip bone, if you're looking down here, the hip unit, which is effectively what my hand represents, has the top of the femur, the top of the big bone in the top of the leg, stuffs into it like that, and it moves around all in here. And supporting all of that are these ligaments and tendon structures that link into the bones and the muscles of the lower extremities. What we want to try and do is work out whether that joint in itself is stiff, i.e. that movement's been restricted, or it's to do with the muscle, okay? Trigger point can do both. What it's very, very good at is making sure that the muscles that attach to all of these parts of the body, arms, extremities of the back, chest muscles, are stretched out enough, are released enough, have enough blood flow to allow that joint to get its mobility, okay? As I said, we're going to focus on the lower body now. So first off, the furthest away from this point here is the foot. So we're going to crack on with some exercises to look at how we release the muscles of the foot to release the joint mechanisms that eventually end up at the hip. If I squat down and my feet are tight, chances are my calves are going to be tight and my knee won't bend properly into that position because I'm tight through here. This has an effect on how my quads are and how my hip is. and then into my lower back, and I could end up being down here, and that shape is all driven out of the fact my foot's tight. So let's have a quick look at your overhead squat to start with before we use the ball. So no weight to start with, absolutely nothing no loads or anything here. Just move down, up and down into the squat. Good. You can see Wes is pretty good. His flexibility is pretty good. His mobility is pretty good. Those two things are different. But we can see immediately that there's got some tightness in his calves. His feet are slightly internally rotated. As a result, he's having to move his feet into this position, possibly because he's stiff in his hips, possibly because there's some stiffness in the lateral side of his leg. Can't really identify why yet. My suspicion is his hips. Come back up again so you don't die. Okay. Now I'm going to give him this particular, the grid to hold above his head, so I can see what happens to his shoulder joints while he's doing this movement too, which we can come on to looking at. Back down into that position. So as we've seen, this has now created some load, but it's also created a tension point. You can see that his shoulder blades are very tight. Wes is actually carrying a shoulder injury that we know about, so that's not surprising. But as a result of that, he's not being able to keep this over his head. Just come up with that for me. The idea would be that it would be an absolutely straight line all the way down his body. So immediately, because of what his feet have had to do and what his knees have done, and we can see we've got some tightness in here, and we've got some tightness through the top of the back here, and probably through the chest here. Next exercise I want to look at quickly is to see exactly where that stiffness and mobility is. So we want to look at this hip. And one of the big things you can do here is, we call it what? As a stalk raise, we call this one. So you just kind of come up into this position here, grab hold of your own knee and tuck it into your chest. And what you will experience here as Wes does this is whether or not, and again, you're going to have to do this as your own feedback here, if you'll feel a little pinch in there. If you're tight in the hip flexor moves two ways, obviously. That's going to feel tight, or you're not going to be able to pull it in as high, and then you'll have some issues around balance on the other leg. So we're dropping down there. We got a good hideout of Wes there. Let's track it onto the other leg here. Yeah, again, you can see there's a little difference in how his hips are moving here. This one's a little bit more mobile, but as a result of this one, there's a little bit of instability here, which might suggest, drop it down there for me, Wes, might suggest to me as a trainer here that there's some glute issues going on, which again, you know, where I was talking about the feet version of potentially affecting the shoulder blades in that overhead movement. If there's some glute issues going on here in this area on the inside of the leg, the adductor region and the hip flexor region is weaker or stronger than the muscles of the outside of the glutes and this side of the body here, which are known as your abducting region. If those things are not in a good ratio of 1-to-1, there's going to be some imbalances. It's going to throw you off. Those movements like squats and lunges aren't going to be as good. Therefore, if they're not as good, they're not going to be as effective at getting you to the body you want to have. Second or last movement we're going to have a quick look at on that lower extremity area there is if you lie down, Wes, we want to look at how his hamstrings are working. And again, moving back into the glutes here. So we've established we've got some sort of tight foot problems. We've established we've got some potential soreness and tightness around the top of the knee area. And then we've just looked at some hip imbalance stuff. So now we need to go down the other way, the posterior chain of the body. So we're going to do just a lying leg raise really here. So if you just pop one leg up for me, we can have a look here at what happens when he raises his leg up. Now, boys are stiff, right? So I'm just going to hold it there for him. What will happen here is if this is short, this muscle here, which is your hamstring muscle, hamstring's a group of muscles rather, which may or may not be in the inside or the outside if we were to investigate that, again with the trigger point kit, he should be really able to get that right up here, okay? Now again, Wes is actually, a reason why Wes is the chosen performer today is he's got some lower body injuries. He's got a dicky hamstring. So it's right that muscle is now even shortening itself up to protect the body. It doesn't want to overstretch. So again, if I didn't know anything about Wes, very quickly I'd be able to say, well, hang on a second, you've got you haven't got 90 degrees of movement in there. Is there something going on? Oh yeah, I've had a hamstring injury. And then I will be able to tell that the body is defending itself by keeping it even tighter. Well, that's no good because it's not going to rehabilitate itself. We need to be able to work through that. We can use the trigger points to do this. Let's have a quick crack on the other side. We might be able to see a little bit more movement or a little bit less movement. Up we go. So immediately you can see a whole bunch. It's like way better. You know, there's a degree of angle there that's much greater. And you can still see he's got tightness. You relax into my hand there. But you can also start to see how lifting this hamstring here raises some of the hip on this side off the floor. And these are all these classic interdependencies that when you're squatting or lunging or doing a weight training, strength training movement, you don't often find out about these weak points. You don't hunt for them, because when the two legs are working or two arms are working or pulling or pushing, you tend to, the body will find a way of getting around the imbalances. When you start to look at work like unilateral work, like single leg exercises or single arm exercises, those imbalances manifest themselves hugely. So what we want to try and do with things like trigger point, with things like mobility drills using banded distraction work or passing work or gapping work, again, all things we'll come on to talk about in the future. We want to try and make sure we address each of the limbs around each of the joint areas individually, so that when they come together to work as a machine, one doesn't let the other down. So now we've done those movements, let's do some stuff with the trigger points. Let's have a look at how those movements look after he's done those things, bearing in mind Wes is an injured man, both in his hamstring and his shoulder. Start at the bottom, always work towards a joint. I quite like to go up the, I quite like to do feet, then we look at calves, we go into a hamstring, glutes, and then come back down through the quads. We're going to start, Wes, with the ball. The ball is a useful tool for the feet. There are miniature versions of this which are actually for the foot. Trigger Point do them specifically for the feet. And they use this little bumpy surface here, and they look a little bit like this. They're great little tools to have, and you can keep them. They're actually very good for things like if you're on an aeroplane. I find I get quite a lot of cramps on an aeroplane, and I don't particularly want to wear thrombosis stockings when I'm flying to hot countries. So I decide that I take one of these things or one of these balls on the plane, and I just roll my feet out. A friend of mine uses it in the cinema while he's watching a film, but whichever you choose, this is a pretty good version. So we're going to work on the two parts of the foot. We've got the medial and the lateral part of a foot. So Wes, go ahead and stand on that. There's a thing with a foot where you'll notice, and it's really about an experience you have with Trigger Point, where moving on it is equally as good as pressing on the zone. And the zone is usually, as a trainer or as a Trigger Point professional, soft tissue person, you know where that is. As a human, it's quite bespoke. Your pain points might be in different areas. Coming back to pain points, if you press on an area with something like this, and it is very painful, back off the pressure. Don't just stand on it and wince. That's not going to be particularly useful. Moving around the area of pain is quite very good. So Wes here is just going to do some passing work here. And then where Wes identifies where he's sorest, he can just then press onto that. A good rule of thumb is using a count of 4 to 5 seconds. Nice slow movements, and there we go. Let's move on from there. So we're going to have a look at rolling on the outside of the foot. Now, depending on how your body moves, you might be a person who pronates or supinates, and that's usually to do with whether you're tight up in your gluteus or in your adductors, and that will affect which way your foot can be. I mean, I know it seems like it's a long way, it's very distal, but that is actually a case. So what we're going to look at is both parts of the foot now, because you can't ignore it. So we're going to have a look at, again, rolling 4 times backwards and forwards until we find out where that critical point is. And then once Wes finds it in his foot, he can have a pin and he can get onto it, hold it, and really curl the toes and open the toes. So the foot does a couple of different things, and boring terminology, but effectively what you're doing is opening and closing the toes will shorten or lengthen the muscles in the bottom of the foot. So that's what we want to do. We want to just open and close the toes around, find our trigger point, and then squeeze onto it or pin onto it. Good. 4 passes of that, and that's usually a good thing to do. We're going to look at the calves now, so I'm going to get Wes to lie down on the floor. You happy with the ball, or do you want to move on to the trigger? Okay. Again, if you use this on your calves, you're a brave human being. But it can be used. If you're on the move all the time and you need to keep something in your sports bag and that's too big, that will do it. But what we're going to look at here, calves are usually in boys are very tight. So what we're going to look at is an applied pressure using the other leg. Now again, if this is too painful, just back that leg off. It's not needed. But we need to get in there in calves on boys, because we tend to try and work through our calves a lot because we want bigger calves. But the other thing about calves is that it benefits from using all the different areas of here. I particularly like the flatter part of the trigger because my calves usually very sore from running. if you don't do much running and you particularly are a strength training person, but you don't give any time of any dedication to your calves, which is quite common amongst male training people, you might need to get into some of these things here because there might not be too much soreness. I have to back off my calves quite a lot, so the flat part works for me well. With Wes, we're going to use the middle part, which is where the fingers are, which is somewhere between the flat palm and the trigger point. It's a sort of medium pressure. Going to apply some extra load with the other leg. And again, we've got two areas in the calf, two calf muscles, so we've got to work both of those calf muscles. Each muscle, we're going to look at separating it into two areas. Internal part here, yeah, which is on this side here, which can be very painful, and this part here on the outside here, which have all got fancy names, which I'm not going to go into, which can be incredibly painful if you're a runner, and can often actually you can feel that all the way up the leg. We're going to go back to our 4 passes, so we're going to Wes is going to show you here, rolling up and down, halfway from the foot to up to the middle of the calf. 4 passes as we did with the foot, and then we're going to do some other movements. We're going to find out where that sweep spot is. He's going to rest on it and he's going to rotate that calf through. Again, 4 passes on that is pretty good. We're trying to encourage blood flow. Blood flow brings in nutrients and takes away toxins. So when you're moving around on a trigger point, you're really helping the muscle open up and get blood flow into it, which is really quite a lot to do with what we use soft tissue work for. So we've done that now. We'll go up, we'll move on to the outside, passing 4 times, rolling outside. Nicely done, all the way through. And again, you can mess around with your toe position in this. A pointed toe can do very different things to a pulled back toe. So let's move up to the second part of the calf. So we're going to look at the gastroc, the top of up here, which is where your gastroc tendon is. Effectively, it's the big stringy tendon behind the back of the knee. And we're going to apply that same internal and lateral movement to this. So crack on with doing some passing in there. So from the mid up to the knee. So you can see quite quickly with this particular muscle group how 2 muscles, we've separated the internal and the external part, and we've separated the lower to the upper part of that particular limb. That's only a 2 muscle group. So again, if you can write this stuff down and you go, right, yes, I've done that, I've done the 4, tick, 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 it's going to help you chunk your time much better and also allow you to track whether or not this is working for you. So you can see quite quickly after we've just done Wes's foot and his calf and his lower limb, how this can take a bit of time. And we know as trainers and as specialists that if we try and get our clients to do this stuff at home, if it's very time consuming and it's not particularly rewarding instantly, i.e. it's not making you pour with sweat, you're not probably going to do it. So again, as I suggested, time chunking, writing down, say I want to address this area and these are the things I'm going to do, being methodical about it is a very good use. But the other thing is that we know with Wes that he's got injuries, and so what we might do is right now I'm going to go past his hamstrings. We know that his hamstring's got an injury in it. It's probably best not to roll a particularly injured muscle if you know it's injured, unless you've been to see a physio or a soft tissue specialist. Mainly because you're not entirely sure what you've done to it. There may be lots of different things going on. It might not be the muscle, it might be the tendon, it might not be the tendon, it might be the ligament. And if you start messing around with pressure on and those sorts of things, that might not, the chances are it's probably fine, but it might not be advisable. So if you do have an injury that you know of, go and see someone first. We're actually not going to worry about his hamstrings because we know with Wes from his overhead squat and his stalk earlier on, that really where his issues are coming from is this glute and this adductor relationship in this ratio. So we're going to go right ahead and look at the glute now. This is an area where you can be very, very mean to yourself or you can back it off a little bit. It's incredibly sore-making in a way that I can only describe as slightly addictive. Glute rolling can be done, you can do it actually just sitting on a chair. But there is a point in your glute, typically where the glute medius is one of the smaller gluteus muscles, which actually, although it's small, is highly responsible for how your hips move, which when you hit that with your trigger, you will know about it. So really, this is an experimental roll in my case. I have to really gingerly get it. Some days it's better than others. But what we're going to do here, Wes is going to show you some swipes on how to get this done. So again, I've written down here, I like to get the gluteus maximus and the gluteus medius. So first up, we're going to look at the middle of the glute. So we're just going to get the sort of where you kind of know your big fat glute muscle is. And we're just going to do exactly the same thing again. We're looking at movement on the, and rolling and moving. So we're going to look at passing. Again, 4 swipes, exactly as we did for the lower limb and the foot. And then we're going to look at, Wes has probably identified by now where his issue is in here, and he's going to have a little crack at moving laterally onto that. And people call this passing or pinning, or what do you want to call it, but ultimately he now knows where his sweet spot is. And it's different for everyone. People's pelvises are built differently, which is why you see people squatting differently. So we've done that now. We're going to have a look at the outside or the medius part of, and this can be just the NB, the sore bit. So let's have a look at rolling that. So we drop down. It tends to be located sort of up on the top here. You can feel it when you're standing up or kneeling in a position like this, less so when you're sitting. You can press into it, and it can feel rather like it's got a bruise just by pressing your thumb in there. And if you were to sort of get on a knee and just move your leg laterally out, you will feel it push your thumb out. A good and well-developed glute medius is responsible for controlling that hip flexion, it's called your SI joint, your sacroiliac joint, which will protect your lower back in pretty much all of the lower body movements, such as squats, lunges, and deadlifts. If the glute medius isn't working, it's not firing, the chances are you're going to have lower back problems. So this is a key area to look at. So again, your sweet spot on this one, lateral movements. What I'm going to do with Wes here, because we know it's a particularly sore point for him, is I'm going to make his day bad by getting him to sit on this. You mustn't say that too loudly around clients, but there we go. So he knows where this position is, all right? You can't see this ball, but trust me, it is right in the sweet spot. And by that I mean it's on a part of his muscle where the hip bone and the muscle are very, very close together. So what all Wes has to do is to control his body weight up and down using his hands and his leg, and then move gently like this. The ball and the hip bone will do the rest of the work. Please do not sit on this in a heavy fashion, because that can leave you in all sorts of trouble. And again, you can start to do things like moving the leg in and out here. So movement of the lower limb will be, because obviously the activation is what happens when the muscle's actually doing its job. So i.e. in a squat, when you're lowering, the muscle's moving, it's opening and it's expanding and it's contracting. So this movement mimics what you're doing down there. So we're going to look at Wes's adductor set right in here. There's loads and loads of little muscles that work on in here, but we're going to have just a quick look at some basic stuff. Again, using the grid, I would recommend this. The ball is not a tool to use in this. It's too small, and we need a broad brush approach to this particular area, utilising the whole of the surface of this. So Wes, you get into position there for an adductor. I mean, I know this position looks like it's the beginning of a good weekend, but I promise you, the thing about this is, again, what we need to be looking at is the hip mobility here. We know that here is responsible for opening the leg. So what Wes is going to be doing is applying pressure with his own hip onto the foam roller. So by rotating his hip or tucking his hip under or over, he's going to be creating pressure onto the trigger point surface. So he can do that. So now once he finds a good position there, again, now he can activate by doing our passing technique. Again, in our grid system, we're doing 4 passes, rolling up and down through the length of the adductors. Again, remember that the adductors attach from inside the hip all the way to the knee, and then again are actually responsible for coming down into the calf. But let's just take the upper limb for a minute, and we've got to separate these 2 zones. So Wes has done that one zone. He's then going to look at doing a passing action here, which is actually just done quite easily, but it can be quite painfully, by opening and closing the leg. Again, as we said with the glutes, the activity of the adductor, when it's being used for the actual exercise that we're working on here, squats or deadlifts, particularly in sumo deadlifts, wide-legged sumo deadlifts, you know, flexion and extension of the knee joint there happens while your adductors are activated. So why not, whilst we're rehabbing, flex and extend the knee joint whilst we're rehabbing the adductor set. So we're mimicking the activity that we're rehabbing or prehabbing for. That is the point about doing all of this stuff. It's not in isolation to your working out in the gym, it's to add performance gains. So that's good there. So let's move down the limb. This is where it can get a little bit more painful because the insertion points there are towards the inside of the knee. And as we know from people who run or people who typically do a lot of impact work like HIIT activities, the insertion points where the muscles attached to the knee joint can be quite sensitive, particularly on the inside of the leg. Again, Wes has operated the 4-pass technique and then some extension and some flexion of the knee joint. Exactly the same as the upper limb. Just be a little bit more careful here. Again, using his own hip, he can apply greater or lesser pressure. If you've got what Kelly Starrett refers to as a super friend, you can have a person apply the pressure as well while he undergoes this. He's obviously not thinking I'm much of a super friend at this minute because that is quite painful. Again, backing on and off. But like training, thanks for that, Wes, like when you train with a muscle, you will progress through higher repetitions or increasing weights and loads. With trigger point and with mobility work, you do need to progress or regress the activity accordingly. If you carry on doing the same thing, your body will get used to it, it'll stop working, and it'll have no effect. But what we want to look at now is just that how quickly those sort of 3 things we did, how did that affect Wes on that particular leg? Bear in mind, we haven't done both sides. We're just looking at his injured leg because we thought, well, today we only had this amount of time, so we're only going to look at his left leg. Let's look at the injured one. Tomorrow we'll have a look at the right leg. By the end of the week, we'll have done the whole body. Let's look at that movement performance. Let's go back to our overhead squat to start with, just to see if there's been any benefit to that activity at all. Let's get down there. Good. Well, already you can see, well, I can, it's tough to see on camera here, that he's this foot is slightly flat on the ground. There's less pronation or supination in that movement with him. Slightly flatter here, which is meaning that he's not as internally rotated. That leg is nicely out here. Again, I'm going to get him to come up because he's injured. But also that hip joint he didn't tilt as much in the hip there. He had a lot more room in that hip to get to a slightly deeper squat. If we'd done the other side, we'd have seen even more depth. And the beauty of the depth of that squat, increasing depth versus adding weight to an exercise particularly, if I took 100 kilos and squatted to parallel, great. But if I squatted to just 6 inches below parallel, I've activated a much bigger percentage of the muscle fibers for a longer period of time. It takes longer to get down and longer to come up. And that time under tension principle it equates to all sorts of benefits in muscle growth, muscle strength, calorie burn, what happens after you've done your... So an extra 6 inches in this case, size really does matter. Let's have a quick look at the single leg lift just to make sure we've got some benefit from the hip exercise we did. Stalk lift, up we go. How's that feeling? A little less tight? Oh, you're definitely better there. Again, what's happened here is because we've loosened up the hip here, made it more mobile in that hip joint here, Wes's lower back in this movement, which right at the beginning was very curved to get that hip up, is now much flatter. So again, we've created some movement there with only a small amount of emphasis. Normally you can do it longer, drop them down. Let's quickly have a look at that hamstring leg. We didn't work the hamstring today because it was injured, but we did work through the lower limb and the hip and the glute. So let's see if it's had any effect at all. Well, I think that just proves it, doesn't it? So there he is, drop him down because I don't want to get that too much. If he was now to go on and train into the gym, start squatting again, he would have benefited hugely from doing that, just that little piece of work. So when you do these activities, a lot of people who have time will come into the gym and rather than spend, say 4 sets doing 10 reps of squats, they might say, well, I'm going to do 3 sets of squats, 10 reps, but before I do that, I'm going to use that first set that I used to do. I'm just going to dedicate that time to doing some mobilization work. Just a quick 5 minutes to do that rather than that extra set. And the 3 sets that you then do will be 30%, 40% better than the ones you would have done before. That is a good use of time. And that is why we try and advocate things like trigger points and advocate things like mobility drills and flexibility drills as much as we do with strength training. Our channel's a little bit different from other fitness channels in as much as we spend a bit more time looking at the detail of why we work out and why we eat in certain ways so that you can remain as strong and as fit as you can and as injury-free as you can. If you do pick up an injury, however, we are looking at all sorts of the techniques of which you can maintain and rehabilitate yourself. Remember to click on the Lomax logo so that you can subscribe.